Welcome to the regular meeting of the school board, the board of directors. This is August 13th. The time is 6:30. Mr. Superintendent, can we have a roll call?
You sure can. Kate Bricks.
Here.
Eric Colby. Jennifer Fleck.
Here.
Diana Freusland.
Here.
Marge Cavoni.
Here.
Pete Hensler.
Here.
Jen Moore.
Here.
Don Perkins. Jerry Keene Dwyer.
Here.
Diana Maciel.
Here.
Okay, thank you. If you would join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, well, good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's enjoying their summer. First thing on the agenda tonight is I would love to welcome our new high school representative, Ayana Maciel, who is a senior this year. And you will get to, as we go along, you'll get to recognize everybody's name and so forth here. And we're very, very happy that you can be with us. And whenever you have something to say, you can feel free.
Thank you.
Okay, so first on the agenda today, we're going to have a discussion about developing a new cost-sharing formula. As everybody is aware, when we had our budget meeting, one of the things that came up was a concern about the fact that it has not changed. It's been 5 years now since we consolidated, and the board felt that it was also appropriate now that we would review it and take a look at it. So with us tonight, we have Mr. Richard Spencer, who is our school attorney, who is going to present us some information on the cost-sharing formula. Mr. Spencer, if you would come to the table, please. I think you've been here before, so you know you have to speak into the microphone.
I have been here before. So Sandy and Don asked me to speak about the cost-sharing formula, and in an RSU such as yours, the cost-sharing formula is determined by the reorganization plan rather than by state law. And one of the things that is true is unless there's a law to the contrary, the cost sharing of what are called the EPS costs, the essential programs and services costs, the cost sharing for that is determined by state law and is not part of your cost sharing formula. And the way that works is that the state figures out your total allocation for eligible EPS costs, and then the municipality, each municipality in the district essentially pays those costs up to a uniform mill rate across the state. And in the case of RSU14, Wyndham's share of the state-approved costs is above that mill rate. So the district, the RSU, gets quite a bit of state subsidy for that. In Raymond's case, if you take the total EPS allocation and divide it up by the number of students and then assign that to the number of students in Wyndham, they can pay all of their EPS allocation without getting up to the state mill rate. So under the state's formula, they apply a lower mill rate for the EPS costs, and they don't get any or practically no state subsidy. And when I say they, what I really mean is that the RSU doesn't get much state subsidy because of Wyndham. In addition, because of Raymond, I'm sorry. In addition, when you all adopt your budget, you usually end up spending more money than what the state approves under the state funding formula. as essential programs and services costs, and that money is called additional local funds. And the additional local funds component of the RSU14 budget for this year was, I think, 3.7 million out of a total budget of about 39 million. So when we talk about the cost sharing formula, it's really those additional local funds and any local debt service that has to be addressed through the cost sharing formula. And then I think you also divide up your adult ed costs using the local cost sharing formula. So it's important to remember that what we're really talking about when we talk about the cost sharing formula is that in your case it really only applies to about 10% of your budget, but that's the amount that's above what the state counts for purposes of calculating the state subsidy. So when Raymond and Wyndham came together to form RSU14, they had to, the reorganization planning committee had to decide how those additional local funds would be divided up. And what the reorganization planning committee came up with was that in order to keep things kind of on the same keel that they had been on before the reorganization, before the RSU was formed, Raymond and Wyndham would each pay the same percentage of additional local costs as their additional local costs in the year before had been to their combined total of additional local costs. And the result of that, and this is a rough percentage, but basically Wyndham's additional local costs before the RSU was formed were about 55% of the total additional local costs, and Raymond's were 45%. And that has basically been the formula that the RSU has been applying to the additional local costs since the RSU was formed. The reorganization planning committee wrote into the plan that at the end of 5 years, the school board was required to review the cost sharing formula and decide whether or not changes to the cost sharing formula were appropriate. And it included a provision that if the board decided that no changes were appropriate, then there could be a citizen petition to require the board to consider changes in the cost sharing formula. So that's really where you are tonight, is that the 5 years is up and the board needs to take a look at the cost sharing formula and decide whether the existing formula is appropriate or whether the formula should be modified. And I think it seems fair to say that it's probably a little bit out of date to be basing your cost sharing formula now on what the additional local funds were 6 or 7 years ago, because that may or may not reflect what the actual costs are in the RSU within the different municipalities. I mean, that made sense when the towns were coming together, because it meant that there wouldn't be a sudden disruption in costs one way or the other. What a lot of RSU's reorganization plans did, but yours didn't, is that they gradually made a transition from the historic costs, whatever they were, over a period of years to some other formula. And so that raises the question of typically how do RSUs or SADs or CSDs in Maine share their costs. And there's a statute that applies to SADs and CSDs, but it doesn't apply to RSUs. RSUs just do it according to their plan or however they then decide to do it. But I thought it might be helpful if I described how it's done in SADs and CSDs, and in fact those are the methods that are typically used in RSUs as well. And the statutes basically provide that costs can be, I mean, the legislature is not entirely helpful in this area, but they say that costs can be divided up based on the fiscal capacity of the municipalities, and that's basically your state valuation, only it's your state valuation averaged over the last 3 years. And that's the fiscal capacity that's used in the school funding formula. So it can be done that way. It can be done based on the number of resident or subsidizable students, which is another way of doing it. Or it can be done by using some of both of those methods. And typically the discussion is that often in an RSU or an SAD, there'll be some communities that have a lot of valuation per pupil, and then there'll be others that don't have very much valuation per pupil. And so for the ones that don't have very much valuation per pupil, if they have to pay based on the number of pupils, their tax rate will be higher. So they tend to think that the fair thing to do would be to base it on valuation or fiscal capacity, because that represents at some level, and this is arguable, an ability to pay. And the high valuation communities tend to think that it would be fairer to base it on the number of pupils, because otherwise they're having to pay for more than the kids that they're actually sending to the system. So between those two factors, there's a lot of discussion that's gone on in the state of Maine over the last 60 years, and if we made a pile of all of the different articles and arguments that have been made over which of those two methods is fair, we would easily fill up this whole room and probably this whole building. And it has been typical that the coastal communities that feel that they have a high valuation but not an ability to pay don't like the school funding formula because they end up getting less state subsidy. And you know, the communities up in northern Maine or in the woods that that don't have very much valuation feel as if the funding formula that takes that into account is necessary, because otherwise they could never raise enough tax revenue to educate their students. So that's an ongoing discussion, and when you figure out the right answer to that, you will have achieved something that probably nobody else in Maine ever has figured out, because you can debate it both ways. I mean, I could sit here and argue for per student, and I could go on the other side of the table and argue for valuation and persuade myself both times. I mean, it's something that you just have to weigh and somehow come up with a solution. Well, the legislature, when it lays out cost sharing formula methods, says that you can either do it according to valuation or fiscal capacity, or you can do it according to number of students, or you can do it based on partially on valuation and partially on number of students, or you can do it by another way, which they don't define. So
Okay.
essentially,
That's helpful.
it says that if you can think it up, you can do it that way. And so there are a few examples where formulas have been developed that aren't based on pupils and valuation. And I think, for instance, in RSU1, which is the Bath area, I think they do it 1/3 based on pupils, 1/3 based on fiscal capacity, and 1/3 based on population. I don't know why they do that, but that's what they do. And there are other formulas that have been developed that take in, that include some other factor. But the most common cost-sharing methods are either fiscal capacity or students, or a combination of the two. And when I say a combination of the two, there are a lot of different combinations that can be applied. In some cases, it's 50% students and 50% valuation. In other cases, it's 75% valuation and 25% students. And I can find you examples around the state that use all different percentages. There are also a few that just use a different formula. And I'm trying to think what it is, but Fry Island in SAD 6, which is a town that doesn't have any year-round residents and no students, contributes to SAD 6 based on a statutory formula, so that there's an amount that they pay into SAD 6, but it's not based purely on their valuation, and it's certainly not based on their number of students, although they would be perhaps interested in, well, I won't say that, but they have no students. So the other thing is, because the legislature has allowed basically any formula that anyone wants, it's possible under a cost-sharing formula to divide up different costs in different ways. For instance, I think you could have a formula that said, okay, our regular additional local funds will be divided up this way, so much based on valuation, so much per pupil, but our debt service costs will be divided up in a different way. So if you had, as I gather, you may have an issue in the RSU about responsibility for debt service costs for a school that's in, or a project that's in one town or the other town, I think you could build into your formula that those debt service costs would be handled in a different manner than the regular operating costs. So with that as kind of a general introduction to the topic of cost sharing, I tried to think of whether there was a way that I could be a little bit helpful to you other than just that general description. And I put together two sheets that I thought might be useful, and one of them is called Timeline and Process for Amending RSU14 Cost Sharing Formula. And the procedure for amending the cost sharing formula in RSU14 is laid out on page 10 and 11 of the RSU's reorganization plan. But if you boil it down, it comes down to about 8 steps. And I summarized those on this sheet. And I also just tried to lay out what might be a general timeline. The reorganization plan says that if you change the cost-sharing formula, it doesn't apply unless it's been approved by the voters 90 days before the start of the fiscal year. So what that means is that if you wanted to change the cost-sharing formula for the year starting July 1, 2015, the voters would have to vote on the proposed changes prior to April 2nd. So with that in mind, I just thought it might be helpful to you to lay out a pro forma schedule to give you some idea of what might be involved in this process if you decide that you want to go down this path. And essentially it looked to me as if you were starting today saying we want to explore changing the cost-sharing formula, you would basically have September, October, and November to for either the board or a subcommittee of the board to review the existing cost-sharing formula and try to develop some proposed changes to the formula. And I think you would really have to get that done, that preliminary work done by pretty much by the end of November in order to stay on schedule to get it done in time for the next fiscal year. And if you did that at your meeting in December, you would have to have a vote on whether to recommend changes to the cost-sharing formula. So you would have had to pretty much develop your thinking about the whole thing by that December meeting. If you decided that you wanted to adopt changes to the cost-sharing formula, you're then required by the plan to have a public hearing to discuss potential changes to the cost-sharing formula that are being recommended. And then after you've had that public hearing, then you complete your review of the proposed changes at your regular meeting in January. And if you decide that you want to proceed with changes, then you have to call another public hearing and a district-wide meeting or referendum of the voters. So you can either do it at a district meeting, like a budget meeting, or you can do it at a referendum. And this procedure requires that before you have the public hearing, you have to prepare a complete impact analysis of the proposed changes in writing and put it on your website before the public hearing. So I, on this pro forma schedule, had you doing that in February and then holding a public hearing in February and then either having a meeting or a referendum in March so that you would have it done before April 2nd. That would also mean that you would know, what your cost-sharing formula was going to be as you prepared your budget for the next year. And it would seem to me you wouldn't want to be, preparing a budget without being able to look and see what the impact would be on each town. And then if you got all of that done and you had the district-wide meeting prior to April 2nd and the meeting voted to change the cost-sharing formula, then that would apply starting in July 1 of 2015. So that's what the process might look like if you decided you wanted to go ahead with this. The second sheet that I put together was just what factors the board might want to consider in reviewing the cost-sharing formula. And as I mentioned, Section 13B of the reorganization plan says that the sharing of costs shall be based on the 3-year average of additional local funding before the RSU was formed. So that takes you back to fiscal 2007, 8, and 9. And I think what that has resulted in is that in the 3 years before the RSU was formed, if you took Raymond's additional local funds and Wyndham's additional local funds and added them together and then figured out how much of that total belonged to Raymond and how much belonged to Wyndham, Raymond was paying about 45% and Wyndham was paying about 65%. 65. 45 and 55, I'm sorry. So that suggests that Raymond's additional local costs before the RSU was formed were quite a lot higher than Wyndham's additional local costs, and that's probably because Raymond was running smaller schools, and so the costs for the smaller schools would be higher compared to the EPS formula than Wyndham's were. And the state, when they do the EPS formula, the most basic calculation is how many teachers per student do you have, and if Raymond had a higher ratio of teachers per student, then that would mean that its additional local funds would tend to be, you know, higher than Wyndham, which may have had a smaller ratio. I haven't gone back to look to see if that's the reason. The other reason could be if Raymond had schools that were not operating at full capacity, they could have had higher, you know, maintenance and operation costs on a per student basis than Wyndham. I mean, it could be, you know, it could be a lot of different factors. It could be that the number of miles traveled per student were higher because it's more rural and there are fewer people. So, but for whatever reason, Raymond had significantly higher additional local costs, and as a result has been paying 45% of the costs of the RSU. One of the things that I would recommend that somebody try to analyze as you take a look at the cost-sharing formula is if you can break down the costs of the RSU based on the different schools as cost centers, that would be could be an indication as to whether the original formula is out of date and doesn't really make sense anymore, given that you're all in an RSU together. If you look at the fiscal capacity of the two towns as it shows up in the ED 279 for 2014-15, and that's actually based on the 3-year average state valuation. I think that would be for 2014-13 and 2012. But if you look at those numbers, Raymond's share of the valuation is 36%, and Wyndham's is 64%. So that's, you know, significantly less than the 45%. And if you look at the pupil numbers, Wyndham has 81% and Raymond has 19%. So that again is even more, you know, a greater variation from the 45-55. The total amount of additional local funds for 2000, that should say 14-15, was $3,749,898. So it's just about $3,750,000 that's being divided up based on the cost-sharing formula, and then I think the adult ed is also divided up in that manner. So other things that you might want to look at is if you can do a breakdown on what are the actual costs being incurred in Wyndham per student and in Raymond per student. That would be helpful to know. There could be other factors that you want to take into account, and then I put in special allocations, meaning if, for instance, you wanted to charge your debt service in a different way, then, in other words, if there were certain costs that it felt more appropriate to have them allocated to one town or the other, you could decide that you wanted to consider that. And then the last thing I put in was transition provisions. And in the RSUs that I worked on when they were being formed, when they were using something like the historic additional local, quite often what we did was we built into the plan that they would use that traditional or historic number, and then they would gradually move to a different formula. So they might, in the first year, do 80% based on the old formula and 20% on the new formula, and then 60% based on the old formula and 40% on the new formula, and phase out into a new formula. So that's just something else that the board and or the committee or whoever you decide on could look at if for any reason the transition from one formula to another seemed to be too much to accomplish in 1 year. And I have something of a theory that increasing people's taxes is much harder to do than to decrease people's taxes.
Good theory.
And, and so one of the things that you sometimes have to look at is whether you can get from here to there in 1 year without being lynched. And so that's something that you may want to think about. I'd be glad to try to answer any questions that you have. And as I say, I have worked on I don't know how many, but over the years, I've worked on a lot of different cost-sharing formulas, and I've seen an awful lot. I mean, I've seen these same issues come up, and they're very real, and it's hard to resolve them because it's hard for anybody not to stand in the shoes of their taxpayers when they're looking at this. But I think one of the things that, as a board, you probably need to do is to, try to make a real effort to put yourself in the shoes of the other town and try to figure out, what seems like the fairest way to do this for everybody.
Pete.
Can you just share with us, just broadly, what are some of the major things that go into the additional local funding? I mean, I know a lot of it is curriculum related, like if it's AP courses or things that fall outside of the essential services and programs. What are some of those things that fall outside of the ESP?
The things that are the most glaring are co-curricular and extracurricular activities, because the state basically puts a very small amount of money into the EPS formula for extra and co-curricular activities. And so that, I think, almost anywhere in the state, the school units are spending more on extra and co-curricular activities than the state allows in the formula. The other things that are, it's fairly individual for each district, but the state sets up these ratios of this is how many teachers you need for so many students. This is how many guidance counselors you need for so many students. This is how many, all the different positions. And so if a school system has smaller classes than those ratios, then that puts them above EPS. If they have a focus on strengthening their guidance and student support programs, that puts them over EPS. It's really very hard to generalize about where different school units go above EPS, and it varies a lot from unit to unit, and you really have to analyze your costs. Actually, you can probably see some of it just by looking at your 279, because for instance, it'll show you what the state's ratio is to pupils and what yours is, and it'll do that for different categories.
You have this in your folder, it's page 1. You want a copy of it? This is pretty fast.
Well, if you look on page 1, I think I can read this one. If you look on
The ED 279.
this is the ED 279, which is the state report. And if you look on page 1 and you go across in section B where it says staff positions, there's a column that that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which says EPS FTE total. That means essential programs and services full-time equivalent total. And then the next column is actual full-time equivalent total. And according to the EPS formula, the state would allow 204 full-time teachers, and you have 218.8. So you probably have slightly smaller classes, or maybe a more diverse program than the state would allow under the EPS formula. In the area of guidance, you have higher level of guidance than the state would fund under the formula. You have fewer librarians, so you make something back by not having as many librarians. You have almost exactly the same number of health personnel. You have a lot more ed techs. That probably represents a decision on the part of the RSU to make fuller use of ed techs than the state allows through the formula. So that you can go down that column. I noticed that you have 4/10 of an administrator more than the state allows, which you're actually almost identical to what the state says you need in terms of administration. So that tells you that those are some of the areas where your actual costs are higher than what the EPS formula allows. The other thing that's true is that the state, when they originally designed the EPS formula, it was supposed to be an adequacy formula, so it was not supposed to be influenced by a cost containment method. It was supposed to say these are the number of people and staff and so on that you need in order to achieve the learning results. But over the years, it's really become something of a cost containment method at the state level. And so I think as one example of that, they don't fund the whole of EPS. They only fund 97% of it. So you're almost automatically going to be 3% over their allocation because they're not funding the full EPS model. So if you basically take the 3% that they're not funding, add the fact that they're not funding co-curricular and extracurricular activities at anywhere near a normal level, and then if you have some staffing variations, that's probably the best answer I could give you without knowing anything much about your actual.
No, and that's fine. I appreciate it, and it's a good starting point. And with this page represents the RSU14 as a whole. Are you suggesting that you mentioned earlier breaking it into each school into a cost center and looking at it in this way as well?
I think if you want to really get a handle on whether the cost sharing formula is out of line, you need to at least do a rough cut at saying are are we paying more per student in one town rather than another? I mean, in this case, if you just look at the student numbers and if you just look at the valuation numbers, it seems like Raymond is paying more than you would expect. And I think part of this exercise would be to see if there's a justification for that. And if there isn't, then I think you would probably move toward a formula that moved away from those historic numbers. And you know, I would think, you know, just looking at the numbers as I have, that there's enough of a disparity between those historic numbers and the valuation and student numbers that unless there's a strong rationale for continuing that, I would think that probably the board would be wanting to look at adjusting the formula to reflect the valuation and the student numbers in one way or another.
So are you all set, Pete? All right, so if we were to do it by school, as you said, that would give us a better feel. Like we could have one school where in the first grade, and this is a fictitious time, but there are, you know, like 18 students per teacher, and you could have another school where there were probably 20, 21. And that would give us
I think you could,
help
I think
the
somebody
ratio.
who was looking at the numbers and had access to the costs and who was familiar with your budgets could probably do an analysis of cost per student look at it in terms of cost per student in the two different towns and see if the costs are significantly different. If they're not significantly different, then it would seem to me that your cost-sharing formula is probably out of line. If they are significantly different, then it's conceivable that the historic figures are still reflect what was going on before the RSU was formed, or if you're discussing whether you should weight valuation or pupils more, if the costs in Raymond are more than the cost per student in Wyndham, that would be an argument for using valuation more than student numbers, in addition to the capacity, the fiscal capacity argument. And so I think having somebody try to do that analysis would probably be one starting point for saying, is the current formula, does it still make sense? I mean, it seems like it did make sense, in 2009. Whether it makes sense in 2015, might be quite a different question.
Yeah. Dawn, do we have those numbers?
Well, I can certainly
If
get
you
them
could
for
do that.
you with some effort, yes.
Okay. Jennifer, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think I got to a lot of, through that discussion, got to a lot of my question. But I was just to clarify one more time that the 3.75 million that we're dividing up would be different if we had different teachers per student in the different schools. So if all the different schools, because this is sort of what you were saying in the beginning, was that one town was getting more EPS coverage than the other.
If you cut your budget by 3.7 million, you wouldn't have any additional local funds.
But if we had all schools with the same ratio of students to teachers, this 3.7 might be a different number, and we had the exact same budget.
If you had, I think I followed you through the first half of that. In other words, if you overall had a lower ratio of teachers to students, you would have lower costs and you would be more in line with the EPS model. Now, if right now the student-teacher ratio the teacher-student ratio is higher in Raymond than it is in Wyndham, then that could be a justification for Raymond paying higher costs than the numbers you would get if you were just looking at the number of students. Because if you're funding, I don't know if you are, but if you're funding classes with 15 students in the Raymond schools and classes with 25 students in the Wyndham schools, then, there are two ways you could deal with that. One would be stop doing that, or the other would be say, okay, we're going to keep doing that, but we're going to reflect it in the cost-sharing formula. Or some combination of those things. But it's definitely true that if the per-student costs, and this is purely by way of example because I haven't studied the numbers, but if they were higher in Raymond because of a situation that the people in Raymond and the district wanted to preserve, that would be a justification for having Raymond pay a higher percentage than otherwise. If, for example, the same thing would be true that if you did it the other way. If Raymond had, 30 kids per class and Wyndham only had 20, then it would make sense to have Wyndham paying more than you would get by just looking at, at students and valuation.
Okay. Thanks.
And then you have to, part of this has got to end up being this discussion of fiscal capacity, which is, at least the way the state looks at school funding, is a stand-in for capacity to pay, and student numbers, which are a stand-in for what actual services are you getting. And one of the things that is true, if you look around the state, the high valuation communities are coastal communities. They used to be the paper mill communities, although that's rapidly changing. And then they're lakefront communities. And so that I'm assuming Raymond has probably more lakefront per student than Wyndham, and they're probably in a situation that's, not unlike Sebago, for instance, which in SAD 61 is a high valuation community because of all the frontage on Sebago and Peabody Pond and so on. So that all, that all factors into this, and there's no magic bullet for resolving that question of fiscal capacity versus student numbers.
Anybody else have anything? I'm sorry, were you done, Jen?
I was done with that. I have another one.
Okay,
if you-
go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to know, you had referred to them as subsidizable students. Is that different than just all students?
I said resident or subsidizable, and the department uses the terms differently, and I think the only difference is that if there's a superintendent's agreement where two superintendents have agreed that a student would be better off going to RSU14 even though they might live somewhere else, then they're treated as a subsidizable student rather than a resident student.
What town would they get allocated to then?
Well, they would just be in the RSU14 numbers.
Okay.
I
We
don't
couldn't
think
divide
they
them
would-
between the two.
I think they'd just
Yeah.
be divided in between the two in the same proportion as the resident students. I think that's probably a tiny
Yeah.
difference.
Okay.
I think that if we were to analyze per pupil cost and the differences between Wyndham and Raymond, they would be significant because of economy of scale, and that's just the reality. So I don't think it's going to be a surprise that it costs a lot more to educate students in Raymond than Wyndham. we've also tried to work with that, and that's not been agreeable to Wyndham. So to try to fill our schools up. So we could deal with overcrowded schools are going to have a much lower per pupil cost because of the numbers of students versus the lower number of students and cost. So that's a complicating factor for me as obviously as
No, and
a Raymond resident, because we could fill those classrooms, but that's not
it's
agreeable.
not politically acceptable to somebody.
Well, to a whole town, right, it's not. So, I mean, so that's a complicating factor, is that there is a disadvantage to Raymond, who's more than willing to have more students, but we could build it, but they won't come.
But then then I suppose the next question you have to ask is, if it's unacceptable to Wyndham to have students go to the Raymond schools, does that mean that Raymond should bear the extra cost of having the schools that aren't full? If it's Wyndham's decision not to send the kids there. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but
But it's one of those.
it's not a linear thing where,
Exactly.
okay, the costs are higher in Raymond because they don't fill the schools, if Wyndham is saying, well, we're not going to send kids to those schools. So, and as I say, there's not going to be a simple answer to this. It's going to be a lot of hard thought that's going to have to go into trying to figure out what's the right formula.
Does Choice have a role in any of this as far as, and I'm just throwing that out there.
I mean, to me, it actually does have a bearing on the costs because the RSU, I don't know if any of you took a course that I took, which was called Ec 1, which was Economics 1, but one of the concepts in Ec 1 is the difference between the average cost and the marginal cost of anything. And in a school, if you, let's say your average cost of the school, if you took all of your costs and averaged them over the total number of students, and you got an average cost of about $9,000. If you added one more student, it wouldn't make your costs go up by $9,000. They might only go up $100 if you didn't have to hire a new teacher or get a new bus, or maybe it'd be a few $100s because you'd have to get some more books. But so the marginal cost of a student is very different from the average cost of a student. So if you have to pay the average cost for a student from Raymond who decides to go somewhere else, and let's say that's $8,000 or $9,000, you haven't saved $8,000 or $9,000 because they didn't go to your system. You may not have saved very much at all. So to that extent, having to pay the average cost rather than the marginal cost may be significantly increasing the costs of the RSU. I think it probably does. And the way the state law is written, the RSU pays the average cost, the state average cost, and then if the cost is higher than that, the town has to pay it. But let's suppose that, just take an example where two students in each of grades 9 through 12 decide to go to some other school, and you have to pay, make it simple, $10,000 a student, and that costs you a total of $80,000. How much would it have cost you if you had 2 more students per grade in the regular program? Probably not much. So in that sense, choice can be considered expensive. On the other hand, if you were the town had choice, you'd say, look, we're just asking for the average cost. And, you know, that's your average cost, so don't blame it on us.
How many students do we now have who are taking choice in Raymond? Do you, off the top of your head, know?
Oh, my gosh, I don't. We have about 50 students per class in the high school, right? So there's 200 there. There's a total of 629. You have, so my math would say about 200.
Oh, no, I mean,
No.
how many students are taking choice for high school?
Going
Oh.
somewhere else.
I'm going somewhere else
I
that
don't
we're,
know off the
okay.
top. I'm
But
sorry.
it's not
I can get you that.
20%?
Is it? So that would be 40 kids?
40 kids, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You're right, so at $10,000, that's,
Well, it might not be 10, but it's, you know,
no, I'm
80.
not disagreeing. Right, it was,
Right.
choice was not free. It was kind of said it was not going to cost anything. It definitely cost the RSU.
and so that,
I will not argue that.
that could also have been a factor in when they did the plan in saying, okay, this is how we're going to do the additional local. I mean,
I don't recall that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it,
But now we have charter schools, which are also going to actually have the same effect as students choose to go to different schools.
right,
It's the
but,
same effect as-
but under the charter law, that affects both towns in the same
Oh,
way.
exactly. No, I understand that, but it affects the whole budget, the RSU budget, in terms of,
Just in a different way.
in a different, right. The money still leaves our district to go to someplace else.
Uh-huh. But that, you know, students from anywhere can still go to charter schools, so that's not a difference between Raymond and,
Yeah.
I mean, that actually might balance out some of the choice. If Raymond has choice and they are sending kids to other schools, they might not have the interest in going to the charter schools that some people in Wyndham might have, because they don't have choice. So.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at that schedule, if you really want to deal with this issue, it seems to me you're going to have to make this something of a priority over the next 3 months to try to put some numbers around these various ideas and see if the board wants to recommend a change to the formula.
Now, I think, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but even if we looked at it and we decided, you know, okay, the formula's fine as is for whatever reason, but we wanted to change the debt service, say we were considering, you know, could we put something in there if we were planning on, say, building a new middle school and it got decided it was not going to affect the Raymond students and it would be built in Wyndham, could something be put in there that the debt service would be allocated 100% to Wyndham?
You could. You would have to go through the same process
I get it.
of changing the cost-sharing formula to say that that's how that debt service would be allocated. So you'd have to follow this schedule. But yeah, that would fall under what I put down as special allocations or other factors.
Okay.
But you can do that. I mean, the truth is,
We can do what we want.
if you can think it up, you can.
Well, I might,
If you can think it up and I can write it down and the voters will vote for it,
I might add it.
You can do it.
We are doing it. We're doing it right now for Wyndham High School.
That's what I thought.
well, that's part of the plan.
Right.
Yeah, that was part of this.
But it's in the formula.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you just, what's in the formula?
What's in the formula is when the two communities came together was that Raymond agreed to pay for a certain percentage of the students, the debt service for a certain percentage of the students at Wyndham High School as a comparative to the whole school. So if it's 200 over, you know, some number over the past 2 years, as I recall, Dick may have it in his mind, but in any event, what I'm saying is there is that already in the formula you have, so.
And the formula we have has individual schools and towns kept the debt service on their own schools. So, for example, Raymond kept the debt service for Raymond Elementary. Wyndham kept the Manchester, so that was already, but that was previous debt. I don't know how we look
That
at
was
new
prior
debt.
debt. Right now, under your formula, if you had new debt,
New debt, yeah.
it would be shared under the
According to-
cost-sharing formula.
Under the cost sharing.
Okay.
So if you wanted to, if you wanted to handle that differently than operating costs, you could, but we would have to make it part of the cost-sharing formula.
So I think you understand the reason some of the taxpayers of Raymond are quite alarmed is the idea of building a middle school in Wyndham, and they're paying 45%. So that's alarming many people. So it's a very good discussion to be having, that we have options and opportunities and ways to go about doing this, so perhaps we can have not so much alarm about 45%, especially given the difference in pupils and valuation. So I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear you say
So
that.
that's
Thank you,
something
Marge,
that,
for
that
asking
can
the
be
question.
addressed
Great.
as part of this process.
Now, on your schedule here, which is great, I like it, when I look at this very formal from the State Board of Education, is that something that would happen if we went through this process, this whole process, and got down to here? We would have to send and get it approved? Or,
What are you looking at from the state board?
It's our
this is
initial
our
original-
certificate of organization of regional, so would we have to submit
It's our original
a
plan.
new one? Would we have to submit a new one?
Oh, you're talking, that's your original reorganization plan.
Yes.
I think once you adopted the new cost-sharing formula, the state would essentially approve a change to your plan that changed the cost-sharing formula. You wouldn't have to go through the process for amending the plan
Okay.
because the plan provides for changing the cost-sharing formula.
Okay, great.
I'd have to talk to the state about whether they staple a new page onto your old plan or cross out the sentence, but you don't have to go through the process of amending the plan to change the cost sharing.
Yes, Tom?
If there are there other questions?
No, go ahead.
Well, no, if
Well,
there are,
I-
go ahead.
I just have a comment. First of all, thank you to bring clarity to this. I was on the original committee as well as Teresa, who's in the audience, that came up with this plan and the percentages. I think it's prudent to make a revision and a modification if necessary, or at least to look at it and consider the data and see what is appropriate. Your timeline is, this is great, because you know how boards operate, and we need guidance.
Yeah, we do.
And how to make things happen and when things happen. So this is perfect.
Can I add one thing to the timeline that I probably should have spelled out in a little bit more detail? You have a choice. If you go through this process, you can either have a district meeting or you can have a district referendum. If you have a district meeting, there's a slightly shorter timeline for having a meeting than for having a referendum. And if you decided to have a referendum, I think you might need to do the step before the referendum a little bit earlier. I don't know what your regular meeting is. What?
First and third? Are you talking those meetings?
Yeah. Well, if you wanted to have a referendum in March, I think you would have to have your public hearing at the beginning of February. You'd have to have your, well, no, I guess you'd be all right. If you called for a district-wide referendum at your January meeting, you could still have that referendum in March. So it still works. But it takes about 45 days to do a referendum. It probably only takes 30 days to do a meeting.
Can I ask, this is for your opinion, there's two choices here, between the district-wide meeting or doing a referendum, in your experience, because it's an off time to have enough a referendum. You know, it's tough enough getting people to come out to a regular
Right.
voting season. Which do you think would be more beneficial? you know, we always say if people care, they should come, but that's nice, but that doesn't always work. We understand that.
You know, this is my own personal preference, is the benefit of a meeting is that people can go to the meeting and discuss
Right.
what they're voting on. And so, in that sense, I think you end up getting a more informed group voting.
I would
On
agree.
the other hand,
I would
you
agree.
probably get more people voting if you have a referendum. Given this schedule, though, I don't think you can have a referendum on the date when there's a
Right.
state election or a reason why people will go out to vote, unless, I think Wyndham has its town meeting in June, right?
Mm-hmm.
When does Raymond have its town meeting?
That was also June.
So you're really gonna be having, if you have a referendum, you're gonna be having it on a date when
Nothing's happening but us.
nothing's happening with you. And, I mean,
Nobody will come.
you know, you can argue it both ways. I'd rather feel that there was a good discussion of the proposal before everybody voted.
Yeah.
But-
Yeah, I think it would be great because people could voice their concerns. They could state their comments. I think it's a good opportunity for people to be able to speak. I know a lot of people don't, but if you really feel that this is something that is of big interest to you, then I would think you'd be interested enough to come and at least
Well,
want to
this-
get up and say something.
I don't know how politic this is, but if you just have a referendum and the way this is written, whoever gets the majority wins the vote. I think if you had a referendum and all the people in Raymond voted in Raymond and all the people in Wyndham voted in Wyndham, if I were from Raymond, where I'm way outnumbered by Wyndham, and they voted not to change the formula to my benefit, and I never even got a chance to make the case to them, I think I'd feel less satisfied than if people all got together at a meeting and actually had to hear each other out. But again, then we probably have the question of where's the meeting going to be? Make it near the town line.
But a district meeting would still be based on votes for both towns.
On the total number of votes,
So it wouldn't be by town the way it would be if we did a referendum. I'm just really trying to,
well,
because actually when we vote on our budget,
if you do it by referendum, it's still not, they vote separately in each town, but the votes are counted. In other words, the towns count the votes in each town, then the town clerks send the votes to you, and then you add up the total, and whoever got the most votes in the RSU,
oh, okay. So
When?
it's an RSU vote, not a
it's an
town
RSU
vote.
vote, not a town vote. The difference between a meeting and a referendum is that in a meeting, everybody's there, and they can
Okay.
hear each other out. In a referendum, they're actually casting their
Separate.
ballots in separate communities, and they don't actually have to talk to each other except at the public hearings. And how many people go to the public hearing? So, anyway, it's,
Okay.
So if we start this process, I'm just throwing this out there, start the process, and we decided this is a very fast process and we might not be able to do it, we could continue it and put it on the ballot in November and have it for 2016. Do we
We're not
have to do
married to
something for
this.
2015 as long as we start a process? I guess that's my question. Do we have to vote on something for the 2015 year, based on what our, this
no, I
says?
think you could say, we can't get this done, and we're not gonna make any changes this year, but we're gonna take it up and try to do it for the following year.
But we could be in the process of trying to do that and do something for another, I'm just throwing out another time.
If I think I understand your question, you wouldn't be able to impact taxation in the next new fiscal year.
Right.
So it
Right.
would be the same formula,
Right.
which
Right.
would be.
Right, but I would rather have us be deliberate than try to rush through something and not feel like people had a chance to think it through and really look at all the data, and have it not impact till the next year.
I mean, it's a possibility. I mean, my preference, and I think maybe the community's preference, would be the sooner the better, and I know you agree with that. And if I can just make a little bird walk, which really doesn't implicate you in this little segment, but having the facilities committees focus on options, of which there are three. There's not just one decided
Right.
option made, as erroneously was reported. That perhaps needs to go on the back burner,
Right.
and this take precedent. And then once this is resolved, we can revisit that once we have kind of the payment deal worked out. Aside from just, I think it's the right thing to do personally, I don't think this board has the capacity to do both at the same time.
And a budget.
And a budget. So I think, as you said, to do it right. My concern is the amount of time on our administration, and so my question to you is, as far as gathering the data and making this happen, because this is very data-driven, and then who do we look to? We look to you. And so my question is, there's a consultant that you mentioned in the first little box. Typically, who do people use for consultants, and how is this information gathered? Is it just in-house, or do you have somebody, is there like a guru out there?
I think the Department of Education has a list of people who do, in the SAD law and the CSD law, you go through this process, and if you can't agree, you're supposed to hire a third-party consultant, and they're usually economists or mediators or former school superintendents, and they do a report and a study and submit it, and make a recommendation, and then that, in the SAD and the CSD law, all the towns have to vote for it in order for it to pass. So it's different in that way from this. In other words, it has to pass in each town, not just collectively. In this unit, it has to pass, it has to pass in the RSU as a whole. To me, the data, most of the data is fairly straightforward,
Okay.
which is
Yeah.
student numbers and valuation. And where it might get trickier is trying to analyze the cost structure in the different towns. And I would really defer to the administration as to whether they think that's something that, they could do, at least in terms of the first cut, or whether you would be wiser to, have an outside person come in and do that.
Okay.
Now, is that something that you guys would have to confer on and get back to us?
I was going to say, yeah. I mean, right now, we're just like maxed right out with the office, getting people back in
Right.
school. But I think we could huddle and come up with a plan, and bring it back to you.
Okay. Go on.
One thing I will say, just, although the data is very important, the hardest part of this is confronting the policy issue of valuation versus student count versus actual cost. And the data's never going to answer that question. It's going to, you're all going to have to put your heads together and say what feels fair, and let's do this. I mean, no matter how much data you get, it'll never get you over that that hump. It's very important to be informed as you're having those discussions, but they won't, it's not going to answer the question.
We know there's no magic bullet. Dawn, were you talking?
In your experience, since right now I'm all about procedure and how to make this happen, do folks have a separate committee? Does the board do it? Or what is the most expedient way, in your experience, that this has happened? Go ahead, I'll let you answer.
Well, I mean, I actually think that probably the most expedient thing to do would be to appoint a subcommittee of less than the whole board with representatives from both towns who would be advisory to the full board. In other words, I don't think the board can delegate this decision, but having a smaller group that, that would work with the administration and me and whoever, and try to see if that smaller group could say, this is what, given everything we can figure out here, this seems like a fair thing, and then bring that back to the full board. That might be easier than having, 8 people, and it also might allow other people on the board to be focusing on education or some other incidental thing.
Yeah, incidental.
Exactly.
The problem with one of the problems with the whole board doing it is we'd have to do it at meetings, and there is other business we would not get done, because as we can see, this can be very time consuming. So that's I think a reasonable recommendation on your part.
I would think that it might be smart to have a working group, but not expect that the working group would have authority to make any decisions, but would just be the people who were going to
Put together options.
Yeah.
put together,
Right.
options
Similar
for
to-
a recommendation
Yeah.
that could
Facilities.
come back to the board. And this is incidental, but I gather that you may also be in the process of having a possible withdrawal process going on. And if that goes forward, I think you want to have a working group dealing with that, because otherwise this stuff completely becomes the thing that all you spend your time dealing with, and it doesn't have much to do with education.
Yeah.
Right.
Grow a life of its own.
What?
It'll grow a life of its own, and it won't be about education. You're right.
So,
Well, you were talking about the data and doing the analysis. I was going to, volunteer to, if the data was available, I can certainly do this analysis and put the numbers together. But then talking about having a committee, I'd be willing to be on the committee and do that piece of it too.
I think
So,
it'd be excellent.
because this is what I do all day. So I do numbers and options, and
So,
if that data is available, sometimes the hard part is just finding the data, and then the analysis is easy. But
thank you for that. So I'm kind of going off track if we're ready to do that, which is back to what Dick's last statement was, which is, I know it's getting a little late, but are you interested to know what the time frame of withdrawal looks like for Raymond? So we have these.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like that.
well, I don't know. I don't know where that is. I gather that the petition was signed and submitted to the Raymond Selectmen. And have they called a vote on
Turn
that
around and
yet?
ask her. She shouldn't, but she can. Teresa, can you come up, please?
Teresa, say that to the select person for Raymond.
Hi there, how are you?
Hi.
Good, I think I talked to you on the phone.
Introduce yourself for the public.
Teresa Sadak, I'm from Raymond. You guys all love hearing me talk, not the sarcasm. I'm the one that started the petition, and I have dragged my feet only because I don't want a new middle school built, and what it concerns me, but questions are coming and answering that I came here tonight, which are great. Like one of the big things is, why are we building a new school when we've got 2 schools in Raymond? And I know when we're sitting here talking about the debt ratio is what it is, about the kids in Raymond, are they going to be penalized because kids won't go from here? I don't think that's a Wyndham thing. I think it's a school board thing to make it consolidated. Where that stands right now is I have the signatures, I have petition. I had a selectmen meeting last night, and we're in the information gathering stage right now. My issue is if this goes forward to building a middle school, then I'm going to push forward. But big question was answered here tonight. Can we put the debt onto Wyndham? And that answers a lot of people's questions in Raymond. It really does. Where it's not on the Raymond side, because people in Raymond don't feel we need it. And it's nothing against the schools, it's just the matter, it's the debt. It really is. So right now, we're sitting on it. We have to file something by September 9th. We have another select board meeting September 2nd to gather more information. And to gather the information, what we're doing right now is trying to put together budgets just to see what it would be to separate and stuff like that.
And what's the September 9th?
September 9th is the deadline. It has to be in before it gets on the November ballot, because we're trying to do it in November. But, like I said, it's gathering information, and tonight it's huge. I think one of the things that does concern people tonight is, Kate, you brought up a really good point, not dragging this out with the ratio. That's another thing that really bothers people of Raymond too, because we are paying such a huge amount, and it's going to be. But looking at your timeline, what if this gets voted down by the people of Wyndham or Raymond? That just kind of throws off the whole timeline. Am I correct? That you have here, because then they have to go back and re-look at it again to come back again for another vote.
The timeline, yeah, well, if it got voted down, then it wouldn't happen.
Right.
I mean, not on this schedule, then we'd have to go through the whole process again.
And it keeps pushing it out even more.
So we have to push it out. It can only happen at the end of the beginning of a fiscal year. So if it didn't get done by June 30th of 2015, then it would have to kick over to June 30th, 2016. That it would be effective as of, if they went through the process, there's no way they're going to go through the process twice between now and June 30th, 2015. That's clear. If it got voted down by the voters and they decided to do another attempt, they'd have to go through the whole process again, and that would kick it over.
Which is 2 years out for Raymond people getting a different number.
If it got voted down, if they went through the process to try to do it on this schedule, but the voters voted no, then it wouldn't happen for 2015-16.
It starts all over.
And we would have to start all over again and see if it could happen for 2016-17.
So then my response to you guys in board would be where if we're going to do like Kate suggested, put the middle school back on hold. To me, that was my issue for going forward with the petition, was because of the new middle school, that I don't feel we needed or that we should have paid. So if we're going to put that on the back burner, then everything else kind of gets put on hold as far as the withdrawal. That's the way I'm looking at it, is what it is.
Okay, that's good information.
Thanks, Teresa. And from looking at your timeline here, if we stuck to the timeline, we would have, by January, we would have a feel for what it's possibly going to look like, And I think a lot of us have been here. That's right, and a lot of us have been here long enough to get somewhat of a feel for how the taxpayers would feel about what the recommendation might be. It does. I mean, we don't speak for the public naturally, but you do kind of get a feel for whether, a sense of whether someone's going to think this is off the wall or, which wouldn't put anything cast in stone, I know.
Well, I mean, there's room here in January for
Sure.
a public meeting.
Right.
Right.
Which is the whole point of
Yep.
getting the voters' views on it. I mean, that's critical, of course, in anything that we do, so.
Wow.
So, in answer to your question, it sounds as if the petition may be, the withdrawal thing may be on hold to see what you guys do. If it gets filed, then, I mean, if it gets filed with the town, then the selectmen have to call a vote on whether they want to start the process. And that'll, probably take 30 days or so, maybe 45 days. Then if they decide to start the process, the selectmen have to appoint 3 people to a withdrawal committee, and the members of the board, of this board, from the withdrawing town, appoint 1 member to that withdrawal committee. Then the withdrawal committee and the board have to develop a withdrawal agreement. And usually what happens is the board would appoint a working group to, try to work out the terms of a withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreements, depending on how complicated they are usually in the range of 30 to 40 pages, because you have to deal with, it's just an amazing amount of detail to try to unscramble the egg. And it takes a while to negotiate the terms of a withdrawal agreement. Then that has to be submitted to the Commissioner of Education, who then gives it tentative approval and schedules a public hearing. Then you have the public hearing. Then after the public hearing, the withdrawal agreement, it can be changed after the public hearing. Then it's resubmitted to the commissioner, who gives it final approval, and then a referendum is scheduled in the town that filed the petition and is seeking to withdraw. And so that whole process is usually about a 9-month process. And I think you probably, at this point, I'm working on some withdrawal agreements now that are close to being finished, that will be voted on for a withdrawal to occur in 2015. I think probably you would be looking at, if they decided to go ahead, you probably would be looking at a withdrawal, in June 30th, 2016. I don't think there's any way you're likely to get all of that done, because not only do you have to have the vote on the withdrawal, but then the withdrawing town has to elect a new school board, and then that school board has to prepare a budget and hire a superintendent and get completely ready to run school for the following year. So it's quite a lengthy process.
For those of you who I'm not going to be able to remember everything he just said. If you picked up, I told some of you, but if you picked up your latest copy of the statutes, the MSMA, because I did mine, and it's all in there. Here at central office. But anyway, yes, Kate.
Right now, we're not talking in givens as far as a divorce, but in your experience with those that you are currently working on, aside from the legal expense to untangle this incredibly complex agreement, what would you say would be the other expenses incurred in this process?
In the withdrawal process?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the process itself is, the actual, you have to have the 2 referendum votes, so you have those expenses.
Mm-hmm.
And have to have their own central office, and, you know, a superintendent, a special education director, a
Which would-
technology
yeah.
director, all of those kinds of things.
Mhm.
So you basically have to recreate the overhead of the central office in both places. And then you have to have separate transportation systems. I mean, you have to undo all the things that you've put together, so,
Quite complex.
I mean, I haven't seen them where they, in most of the ones I've worked on, I haven't come away feeling as if overall there's, you know, a cost savings or actually an educational benefit. It's more usually about local control and power, but in the context of the cost sharing, you know, it could be that there would be a savings if Raymond is paying more than its share of the costs. I mean, that's what you would probably figure out by doing the analysis of the costs of the schools and so on.
Right.
But mostly, I mean, at least my observation is, it's either local control, people mad that they were forced to join together in the first place, and just angry that they were in a shotgun marriage, so to speak. And those have been the drivers in the other situations I've seen.
Thank you. Pete?
Yeah, I don't want to complicate things, but, you know, we've been talking about two different processes, and while you're here, I want to make sure that I'm understanding. So, getting back to the cost sharing formula process, I agree. I think it needs to be a priority for us, and we all want it to be fair. And we're going to have representation from both towns on a subcommittee if we do, move forward that way. So, to understand the process, if we have a subcommittee get together and we do the analysis, we weigh how we think it should be measured, and we come to the conclusion that the cost sharing formula is actually pretty accurate the way it is. You mentioned that there's the opportunity for a citizen initiative to change it. Because we're looking at this as an RSU, who would initiate a citizen process? Is it a town-driven thing, or what do you know about that? And the time frame that might have to fall under?
Don't say it.
Yeah.
This is from your reorganization plan. It says, notwithstanding the whole thing about reviewing it every 5 years and so on, should the board decide not to consider any changes in the formula in the years designated for review, a petition signed by a number of voters that is at least 10% of the number of voters from the RSU who voted in the last gubernatorial election shall cause the board to conduct a review and to report the decisions that come from that review at a regularly scheduled meeting of the board. So actually, the way that reads, if you decided you weren't going to do anything about this, you could get a petition that required you to look at it. But it doesn't seem to me that it requires you to do anything.
So if we make a good faith effort, obviously, and do that and come to a conclusion.
I don't think that the petition then creates a new process.
Good to know.
It'll cause the board to conduct the review and to report the decisions that come from that review. So if you've done the review and reported your conclusion, if your conclusion was the formula is fair as it is and we're not going to change it, I think you would have met your legal obligation under this plan.
Are we all set? Hold on. Thank you.
I just have one thing. I would just like an appeal to the people of Raymond that hold off on the withdrawal process and allow us to really continue with what is very, very difficult work to just begin this cost-sharing formula. And it would really throw a huge monkey wrench into our work and being, good stewards of our educational system. So I would just ask that this would be tabled or put aside and let us do our work. That it's premature, given where I think we are as a board. So that's my last thing I'll say.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very
you.
informative.
I know.
We'll take a 5-minute break. That'd be great.
That'd be fabulous.
Next on the agenda, we have a report on the proficiency-based diploma from Christine Hessler, our Director of Curriculum. Hello, welcome. We love to see you. You always have such great stuff to tell
I
us
do,
about.
and I'm really excited, so I'm probably going to move my hands all over the place. But tonight, you've asked me to come forward and give you an update on the proficiency-based diploma. In June, at the end of the year, I gave you a kind of a written update of where we are. We've been talking about this work for an awful long time. This is a journey that RSU14 has been on since before even I arrived, almost 3 years ago now. And because based on our strategic plan, what we feel is best for kids, and you have allowed us to become leaders in this area. And with that leadership, there's been some changes at the state level, which we need to talk about. We, of course, when we started this journey last year, we were told that LD 1422 would go into place for our graduating students in 2018, which were our 8th graders last year. They're now freshmen. Since that time, the state has recognized the amount of work that needs to go into changing from a credit system to a proficiency-based standards graduation system. So that has never deterred us here. You know we've updated you many times from our principals at the high school. And so what I wanted to share with you is the first handout that I gave to you tonight is called the 10 Principles of Proficiency-Based Learning. And I think that these 10 principles really outline the work that we're trying to do right here. You know, this is a great one-pager that talks about that we are clear on our expectations of students, that we are aligned K to 12, that our curriculum is transparent, that our grading practices are transparent, that we allow students to have voice and choice, and that we allow students to be met at every level when they start one grade going into the next grade. You've supported us in training our staff and making this huge transition and changing the way that we do things in the RSU. We have a number of exciting things coming up to share with you this year, but the big push while we were doing this work was the diploma sitting there saying, uh-oh, we need to get started. And so going back to what the state has spoken to every school district, there was a huge superintendent's conference at the end of June, dovetailed with the MPA conference to do just this work. They gathered a needs assessment from all the districts and realizing, looking at every single thing that had to be done, that instead of making it mandatory that you open for 2018, the state has granted a variety of extensions. There are 6 extensions that each RSU has to decide on what they're going to do. They range from having every single thing done, be ready for 2018, down to just beginning to have the conversations in your communities. There are 6 of them. I updated you in your packet in June. We felt as a team, when we looked at the extensions, that option 3 or extension 3 matches perfectly for what we're doing. The other thing I wanted to share with you is if you did read the Wyndham Eagle, the great article that says Wyndham High School leads the way for proficiency-based, you'll know that Principal Chris Howell was asked to go to the states, as very select educators were, to talk about the extension language and why this had to be done. So we felt as an RSU that option 3 is the best extension. And the reason for that, when I look at the extension language, is that option 3 says that our K to 8 system will be aligned before we issue any proficiency-based diplomas in the high school. The other extensions talk only about high school. And we strongly believe here that if we're going to make changes to the high school, it doesn't make any sense for us to have changes in one place and not in the other. Because if students are not prepared to enter the high school, then we can't do anything in a 4-year race to get kids ready under this new law. So we are continuing forward with aligning everything K to 12. Last year at the high school, we reported on, and we're very excited about, our high school curriculum leaders in all of the departments at the high school have identified their graduation standards and performance indicators and are now working on common scoring guides, which then dovetail into assessments. And those standards have been pushed all the way down to K, with different levels of performance in each of the grade spans. The work has continued all summer, so we're in different parts for different content areas, but it's all being aligned, the same protocols, the same steps. so that every child, when they start kindergarten, knows their pathway all the way up through high school. The exciting thing for us is this gives us a little bit more breathing room than trying to get it done in the next couple pieces. This gives us to 2020 so that we can do this really, really well. It's also helpful for community to know is as we make changes in elementary and middle, it's a little bit more comfortable than playing the game with the diploma at the end. And those practices can go through and they're become a little bit more comfortable as we move this all the way up to the high school. The other piece that I think is really important for you to share, which I guess I'll just share because I was pretty excited. At the superintendent's conference, this came out with a commissioner, and a lot of people had been doing some talking, but nobody had really moved on it. And we saw people coming out of that session or those days, just other districts really nervous and like, oh my gosh, we haven't done a thing. And yet we had Sandy Prince who was like, oh, this is what we've been doing. And it felt really good to see the work that we had been doing was right on track, right where we should be, and we didn't have any panic buttons. For us, it was like, okay, cool, what's our next step? What's our next process that we're doing? So it felt really good to kind of be accosted by some people in the area, like, okay, we heard what you're doing, now you got to tell us now. And taking notes and writing
Can we
things down.
charge?
But I think that's important for you to know that the work that you supported for us to do is people are knocking on the door saying, we heard you're figuring this out, and we're the first to say, we don't have it all figured out, but here's what we're doing, and here's what's worked, and here's where we've tweaked, and we know that there's no magic formula to do this. We have to figure this out, and we have to figure it out based on what's best for RSU14, and that's always been key. This community, when I started here, we just couldn't say, well, here's standards and stuff that other people are doing, because people here hold very value to their heart of what they believe what's best for our kids. And so we're creating it based on what we feel is the best things for kids in the RSU, which is a lot more work, but it's really exciting, and the teachers are really involved with this piece. Today, for example, we had jump rope training, which is our new grading and reporting system you were piloting that you're going to hear a lot more about. And the energy in the room was just like, oh my gosh, this is real. This tool is going to help us. We're going to be able to share with parents where the child actually is and where the next steps are going to be. So there's a lot of excitement building. There's a lot of nervousness too. I mean, I won't lie. This is a lot of hard work. But when we kind of look at it globally and in the state of Maine, we're pretty excited for where we are and to continue our path. The other piece, looking at the extension language and what we're doing right now, the high school was invited down for their first accreditation pre-meeting. I believe they're up in 2017, that process that comes through. Everything that the accreditation committee is looking for is what we're doing in our plan. Chris Howell came back and said, oh my gosh, we don't have to change what we're doing to satisfy an accreditation. They want the work that we're invested in, which was another piece that was really validating for us. And so tonight I just wanted to share with you that on September 17th, we will be submitting our application for the option 3. And in that application, we're asked to state the benchmark, what we've already done in the past, which we can easily do, what our benchmarks are for the following year, document what we are doing in the process of community involvement and procedures and curriculum, I mean everything under the sun, and those are in our blueprint for this year. So we would be doing these updates with the state as we go along this journey, and we found it very natural just to kind of report on what we're doing. So that's where we are with the diploma piece. So it's exciting. There are, like I said, there are people knocking at our door. The other thing I wanted to share with you is RSU14 has been asked to present at the end of October at the Maine Curriculum Leaders Association to share our story about how we started this journey and what we did, as there are many people in the state who haven't even opened page 1. And we're going to share what we're doing and what's worked with us with the disclaimers. This is who we are and this is what's working for us. And hopefully provide some insight for some people and hopefully help to streamline their process. We don't have it all figured out. We've always been honest about that, but we have people who are trying things, and I honestly feel we have the best interest of the kids as we do this work. So I think hopefully you saw this article. I was pretty excited when I came back and read that piece. I thought it was really well done and really captured the resources we've been able to use. We will be getting, again, diploma funds. It's kind of nicknamed that from the state, and we're using those funds to continue working with our coach from Great Schools Partnership, Angela Hardy, who's been instrumental in giving us the steps and the protocols to do this hard work, and helping us with our staff and how we use our PLC time and how do we look at standards and know that they're valuable and viable for students. So she really holds up the mirror for us and is a good critical friend to help us move in that direction. So we're going to continue our work with her, which is, for us, really exciting. We met with her yesterday for 3 hours, and we all left like, oh my God, we have so much more to do. And she reminded us, look how far you've come, and in essence, where we're going to be going. She's also going to do some speaking with us on opening day to kind of give the staff a kind of a little bit of a bird's eye view when you come out of the trees and kind of see where you are based on where other people are. I think it'll be a nice message for people to see. Pete?
Christine, thanks. Absolutely. Are there incentives for going with various options?
No, there's no incentive.
No incentives?
No.
So the school just goes with what they feel is the closest fit?
Correct. One of the options, or people starting right at the beginning, is they have an option to have somebody from the Department of Education come and monitor them and work with them and check in with them. We felt we didn't need that piece. We feel really on track with where we're doing. So I think what the DOE did was they really looked hard at where everybody was and provided options for people to help them get going or to continue what they were doing. So I think they were very thoughtful about offering 6 options instead of a mandate. I mean, you could just go along with it and be compliant, but that's not who we are, and we're doing this work for a huge reason. It isn't just to check off the box and say, oh, we're doing this to the state. We're doing this because we believe it's best for students. So,
Anyone else? Kate?
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased that we've bumped it out to give us the gift of time instead of just jumping on the bandwagon and trying to do it because we're supposed to. So I appreciate not only your effort at the helm, but all the staff and all
it's
the
been amazing.
behind the scenes that are trying to put all these pieces to this gigundous puzzle together. We've been talking about this for quite some time, so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we're going to communicate this to the public and the parents, because it's kind of like the dates have changed, and where are we now? It's not the freshman class. So.
Correct. We are meeting as an A-team in the next couple of weeks. That's one of the pieces in our blueprint is community involvement, and we actually attended a great session at the MPA conference on communication with your community. So we've got some kind of some new ideas. I think, how do we do this besides, we want to have a public meeting, but how do you get people there? How do you get people engaged in these conversations? So we're looking at, there's some different strategies we may try, which, I think we're looking at because it's, listservs and flyers, and we can do all those pieces, but we really want to get engagement in the conversation and what it means for your child. I know each of the buildings hold, like I know Kyle does a Coffee with Kyle down to primary school, and parents who are coming are able to have really rich conversations, and Randy has had some up at Raymond and Wyndham Middle School, and Chris did a really nice job at opening for the 8th graders, the incoming 9th graders coming in. So how else can we engage in our crazy busy school schedule to have these community forums to talk about these pieces? And what does it mean? And get some of the, we had some scary pieces. People are obviously nervous. What do you mean you're changing this? Well, let's tell you about, we're not taking anything away, but we want to give you more information about your student. And I think that's really exciting as a parent. I don't want to see that my child met a standard in math. I want to know what it was in math because I want to know what I can help them with.
As far as policy is concerned, we have a meeting scheduled the first week of September to look over the graduation policy. Is there a huge? Tell me about the time frame. I get nervous, and then I'm told don't get nervous. So what?
We need to have, I would say, everything in place by 2020.
So there's not a huge rush.
There isn't a huge rush. There are, what's popping up now through MSMA and Drummond Woodsum are exemplar policies that we can start looking at and referring to. We don't have to start from scratch, which is nice that it's just not one group doing this. It's an entire state. So I think forces are becoming pulled together. You know, we even thought, like, what is Sebago Alliance, those schools doing together? Can we put our heads together? I know we meet as curriculum leaders in Southern Maine, and we're all the same thing. We can't all do this alone. So what are people using, or what are you starting with to help streamline this process for that piece?
One of the things, Chris, back at the end of May, had sent me not only the graduation requirements, but there are 13 other policies
Yeah.
that are impacted by all of this. And it's interesting. I mean, one that I would have never thought of is academic eligibility.
Yeah.
How do you decide whether someone's eligible if you're using 1, 2, 3, 4?
That was a big conversation at the MCL summit, and there are some schools have already started that piece. So those are pieces we want to tap into and see what their process was. So we're not the first one out on academic eligibility. So we've got some pieces to do. We kind of have our list of things, and we have some time.
Right,
to,
which is
really
why I'm so
thoroughly
thrilled.
pull this together and do it really, really well.
And particularly when I look at, and this is, to my knowledge, a new policy, it's transcripts.
Yes.
That's huge. So we'll have to be very thoughtful and hopefully have some examples to.
We've gathered some really good ones, so we're pretty excited about that.
Okay.
We're working with Jump Rope. They're helping us develop those pieces, but I think Chris Howell has stated before, we're looking at giving a dual side, two sides, and here's what colleges always look at, and then flip it over. Here's some more information about the student. So we know that each kid gets 5 to 6 minutes on the table when they review those college applications, and we're not going to shortchange any kid, but let us give you more about that student. And that's what colleges are saying they're looking for. They want to know this student, what they're able to do, and where they are in certain standards. And more is better right now, but not bazillion more, because they're not going to look at that. But putting it together so that we're marrying those two worlds.
One thing that I never considered that was mentioned to me by a staff member is the notion of a mid-check in the grade. I mean, if you're on a continuum, you're on a continuum, and I don't know whether, I mean, this will be interesting, whether we will still need, there may be a need to touch base as a parent with the teacher just for your, but as far as a progress, meeting, it's all right there.
All right there. That was evident today as we are beginning our pilot of Jump Rope. One of the things that struck teachers, which I said is, usually when report card time is coming, it's like, oh God, shut down, and this is all I'm doing is grades. Putting everything in as you go along, it's in there. You can click a button, and
There's
at
no
any
deadline.
point in time, here's where your child is at for this day. So it's not a stop and figure it all out kind of piece, which is
Right.
really exciting
That is good.
for teachers. And I also feel the flow of instruction. We're not going to, I'm doing grades and I'm doing this and we've got to stop, and it can just continue to go where the student is. So, and we'll be doing some evenings to share with parents the new Jump Rope grading and reporting system so that they can get a handle on it. They can ask some really good questions. I think they're going to be thrilled. It's going to give you so much more information about your child and where they are.
Is this a pilot or is this a given in certain buildings?
It's widespread. Both Raymond buildings are everyone is doing Jump Rope.
Okay.
Manchester School is doing Jump Rope. There's a very big pilot group at Wyndham Primary, another one at Wyndham Middle, and then one at the high school. The high school are still reporting. Actually, the poor high school teachers that are playing with this are kind of playing in a sandbox because we have a lot of questions about that piece. And so they're going to play, but they're also going to report traditionally in IC. So they're actually going to kind of dabble in both to give us feedback and figure out these pieces as we go along. So that's where we will stand with that piece, and we'll be communicating out. I mean, you may like if you're at a primary school and you have 2 children, one child may be getting a report in Jump Rope, and one might be getting the traditional one in Infinite Campus. So that will be explained out because we really want to do this really well before we unroll everything out for staff and for parents. So,
Does this require any technology, major investment? No.
nope. And the great thing is this is so cool. All of our trainings today, the way that Jump Rope is set up is it's built by educators. And so let's say that you are panicked and something won't work, you actually click a button that's their contact thing, and you write in the subject what your problem, is, and there's even a pull down to give you your emotion, like panicked or really everyone thought that was the best thing. So they want to know your state of mind, and then they want you to be as specific as possible, like Marge Gavoni, her math score isn't showing up or it's not trending correctly. Well, there's also a little checkbox that takes a screenshot of your problem, and they get it. So that what the message was today is, if something isn't working, do not email Christine. Click this button. Because then I'd have to interpret it, get it to somebody else, and get back to them. They can see it, they want to see it, and they will directly communicate with their teachers right back. So that was a neat process. So
That's great. Jennifer?
Oh, my question got answered in the conversation.
Oh.
All right,
all set, Kate?
I had a quickie.
Yeah.
You call them diploma funds? Is that what you said?
The state of Maine has allocated per law 1/100th of your allocation, which for Wyndham and Raymond works out to about $30,000 we get in federal funds or state funds to do this work. And so we've used that work for purchasing materials for the high school staff to read, the coaching for Great Schools Partnership. If we need to send people to a conference on proficiency-based learning, we can use those funds. We don't have to draw from our general funds.
Okay.
Those are earmarked for the high school, the work that we're doing with that piece.
Will that cover our costs, or do we not even know that now?
It did last year.
Okay.
It did last year. We did our coaching. We used all of the funds because it's what we want to do. But that is, generously this board, we also have summer curriculum money. We continue using that piece. But for the big pieces, we're using our funds to bring experts in to help us move this process forward. And the law states that if you do not receive those funds for a year, then the year you're supposed to implement gets pushed back another year. So I don't think we'll see the fund. We hearing the funds are fine and they're coming. We know that those things can always change, but it is in the law that if we do not get the funding, that it pushes everything back out another year.
Okay.
So
Great.
Yeah, I know.
So first of all, I want to mention that I think it's really good that proficiency-based is going K to 12. So I think it's important that, if you are accustomed to it, it'll fit you better once you hit high school. And being a student who's about to be a senior, I've never had standards-based. I had it, once in one class in 7th grade. So if I'm putting myself in the shoes of, say, a freshman this year who's going to graduate with it, what is the benefit of proficiency-based learning as I graduate and go into college, and how long, like you mentioned transcripts and a double side, how long does the double go? Is it going to be for 10 years, for 20 years?
we don't know that.
Yeah, okay.
We're anticipating, unless the colleges say, we don't need any more, grade point average, pieces like that. We're planning to keep it in place till it seems for us to be the right and responsible thing to do for students. Right now, your freshmen are not impacted at all. They will be under the traditional system. I think you're going to be seeing a lot of changes in instruction, which is really exciting. Why is proficiency-based better? I think I'll use a perfect analogy when we started this work, is if I'm in an English class and I have, there are 8 units that I have to complete for the end of that year, and I do really well on 6 of them, and I pass them, and I cruising right along, and the last 2 I decide, I am done, I am not doing the work. Well, right now it gets averaged together, and I'm going to get my B-, and I'm going to move on. But I don't know that information of those last 2. In a proficiency-based system, you don't get credit or proficient until you do those last 2. So it's ensuring that when you leave and you're proficient in those skills, that you've demonstrated that you know them and you can perform those really well. So are gone are the days of, I'm going to do all my homework and raise my hand, and I may not do anything, but I'm going to get that participation grade and look really good. You have to prove it, that you know it, and you can show it. And we're going to have multiple ways for you to do that. So as a learner, you're going to leave with, I believe, a better set of secure skills and ready to move to the next level. Because once you hit college, even if you show up every day and you raise your hand, you don't know it, you don't know it. And there isn't as much support for you. So that's what we're trying to build to help kids when they leave, that they're college and career ready. So whatever path you choose when you leave Wyndham High School, we want to ensure that you have everything that you need. And we've identified those needs by our graduation standards. We're saying every student that leaves here, we want them proficient in this. The really cool thing about Wyndham High School, and you may notice it more this year, it's kind of all hands on deck once we get to December, and we notice kids who are, uh-oh, I'm not sure they're going to make it. Staff are crawling out of the woodwork, figuring out, I'm going to take this one and have him come down this period because he really needs to get this piece done. That should be happening every day. We do that really, really well second half of the year. We need to be doing that all the time. And I think this is what's going to help us with our instructional piece. And you're going to be in charge of your own learning. You're going to know your path, and you're going to know what you need to do. And once you accomplish one goal, you'll know what your next step is. So you'll be in charge, of that piece.
Okay.
To think about.
Yeah, no, it is just because it's so different. Like in my last year, it's all coming. My mom's a teacher, so I hear her side of it also. How will that affect things like the gifted and talented program or honors classes, AP classes that are just different altogether?
Correct. Well, your AP ones, we have a set of graduation standards. That doesn't mean you can't go over and above those standards.
Right, yeah.
So
okay.
those pieces will still stay in place. As a student, I would envision, my children will go through this system because they're little, not here but another place, but I can envision them knowing, okay, they may be a sophomore and finish all their English standards. So what's my next step? Well, I'm going to do my honors, and then maybe I can do some college pieces that we've now brought in because kids are meeting their graduation standards early. Wouldn't that be a great problem to have? To say, hey, you're here, why don't you do some college stuff and get credits for you to leave, and you're starting college with 9 credits already done in your own school where you're comfortable and getting your support. Gifted and talented is that's a tough one. That's what we're looking at. How do we support students in those areas? And I have to tell you, Kim McBride is right on this, and it's really exciting for that piece, is how do we support students who maybe are not identified as gifted and talented, but are in these standards that are really high? Can we help support them on this piece so that maybe we can broaden that a little bit more? So that's a big piece because that's another grant too.
Right. And then one more quick thing. How are you planning on communicating it to students? I know you mentioned, a lot about parents. It's obviously really important, but this is the first I'm hearing of it.
Yeah. Well, and that's
obviously it's helping, but
I think if you were in the younger grades, you'd be hearing a lot more.
Right.
The staff has been working really hard in understanding kids, building classroom codes of cooperations and class visions and SOPs, which are standard operating procedures, and talking about, here's when I've just done a lesson and now it's your independent work, where you have your own list of independent work based on where you are. So for them, this isn't foreign, but for you, it is very foreign. So I would love for you to come with me and visit some of the younger grades and see some of this in action.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think as it's becoming natural for our younger students, and as they're moving up, it's continuing. So it's, again, talking with students about what's changing in my classroom, or a teacher saying to them, you're meeting this standard and you have some voice and choice. What do you want to do to show me that you know this standard? You've done all this practicing. What do you want to show based on the scoring guide? What are your ideas about, do you have to write a paper or can you do a presentation instead? So I think those are some pieces we're going to see changing, which is exciting.
Yeah.
And hopefully engaging for students. So.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there anybody else? Pete?
Christine, in a standards or proficiency-based learning environment, how do we encourage students to go beyond just achieving the standards?
Well, on our scoring guides, your 3 is proficient, and then there's a 4. When students are allowed to help plan what they need to do, as a former teacher classroom, when you give kids an opportunity to show what they know, they go so much further and above than what we think. I think it's tapping into their mindset. I think it's tapping into their drive about what they want to do and encouraging that. So, you know, I think that's a culture shift for kids, because I think as the older they get, they want to do what they need to do and move on. But if they're allowed to have some choice in what they're doing, and if they're studying a topic that really entices them, and having staff encourage that, model that, I think that's where we'll be headed. I mean, I don't think there's a magic answer or formula. I think we're starting to see that. Kids are expanding on projects or their thinking because they're really engaged in their learning. And I think that's the piece, is they need to know it isn't just a check-off box and get everything done, because then I'm going to sit and I don't know what else to do. It's, okay, well, you've done this. What's your next plan? And I think that's the piece that will encourage kids to continue to keep going higher. So.
Exciting. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're always interesting and you're contagious.
I'm always
You are really contagious. I mean, your
You know what I'm gonna
your
say to you.
passion is like, it just.
I spent the whole day with staff, so this
still going.
doesn't happen without the teachers and the staff that we have. And they'll pose things and say, how are we going to do this? I'm like, I don't know, but let me run around and find some suggestions, and then they attack it, and it's great. So,
Like I said, it's contagious, see? Spill off on it. Yeah. Great, thank you.
we do, I have power back.
Good. Okay, next on the agenda is appointments. If someone would like to make a motion, but I will state before that we start that these are all replacements. Correct.
Okay. I move to approve the appointment of the following employees for the 2014-15 school year, and I must read them correct. Gregory Brown, 4/5 English teacher, 1 year, Wyndham High School. Steve Clark, guidance counselor, Wyndham High School. Courtney Espijo, 2 5th grade, 2 teacher, 1 year at Wyndham Primary School. Barry Lewis, math teacher, Wyndham High School. Carrie Less, school nurse, RES, JSMS. Stacy Lozier, grade 1 teacher at Wyndham Primary School. Akela Scorza, grade 1 teacher, Wyndham Primary School. William Shea, licensed clinical social worker at the Real School. Aaron Talon, PE teacher at Wyndham Middle School, and that's it.
Second?
Okay, I have a first and a second. Is there anyone from the public? There is, I don't think Christine wants to talk. Those in the public, is there any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none. All those in favor? It is unanimous. I will say, for some of us that have been here longer, this looks a little different than what we're used to. I did talk to Cindy, and she will be emailing, at the end of September, she will be emailing us the salaries, you know, what they're hired in as, and the salaries, because this was done because in a hurry to get them in so they could notify where they are. She didn't want to make sure, she wanted to make sure there were no mistakes before we read it aloud.
So in the future,
And
it
so
will go
we
back to the old format.
We'll get it.
Okay.
Okay. Next on the agenda is the appointments for Sebago Ed Alliance. And of course, as fiscal agent, we do the hiring.
I move to approve the appointment of the following employees for the 2014-2015 school year. Eric Beniston, social worker at the Alliance School, and Gabriel Schiff, social worker at the Alliance School.
Second.
Okay, seeing nobody from the public, are there anything from the board? Seeing none, all those in favor? It is unanimous. Okay, next on the agenda is a lease purchase of school buses, which is something we do every year. We've had Mike before us before, and he has gone through how he is doing a rotation of the buses now. So for those of you who are newer, in the past, he would come, it would accumulate and he'd come before with this gigantic bus bill. So take a motion on that.
I move to award the bid for the lease purchase of two 2015 IC International 77-passenger integrated body conventional school buses to DATCO Sales and Service of New Britain, Connecticut, and the amount of $170,404. Did I say that right? Okay. I'm done.
Second. Okay, no one's from the public. Any comments from the board? Seeing none. All those in favor?
I move to authorize the superintendent to enter into the financing agreement for the lease purchase of the awarded bid for two school buses through Anastasio Bank at $170,404 at 2.72% fixed, advertised over 5 years at an annual cost of $35,934.12, should that be in the best interest of the city.
Second.
Public, any comment from the board? Seeing none, we won't read that. All those in favor? It is unanimous. Okay, quick question, are these the same buses we usually get? Are we still,
Actually, we've migrated to the this model. This is now the 8th one that we will have. We initially were a buyer of the Thomas bodies, but they have a new version called the C2 that has not been reliable. It's really more plastic on plastic than the riveted metal. So we've been in the habit lately of buying in this, and this is the regular fleet purchase in terms of the notion of making sure that we have a unified, stock of what we need to repair things. And
Right. Thank you. Okay,
Can I just ask, how much do we get reimbursed, if the public knows, from the state for this cost?
Thank you. There is additional funds that are allocated for certain programs or purchases. This is one, you're correct in that. We're roughly a 41% receiver from the state, so it falls under that category. So we receive a good sum of this back through the EPS formula, which is why, if I may, that when the time comes at the end of the year when we may be able to retire some of our lease purchase debt, we don't normally do that because we'd be losing money, if you will, from state allocation.
thank you. Okay, report of the secretary.
I move to approve the minutes of the June 18th, 2014 meeting.
Second.
Okay, there's the public. Any comments from the board? Seeing none. All those in favor? Oops, it is unanimous. Before we adjourn, I wanted to just remind everybody about opening day, the 25th, to let, I think Cindy had sent a thing out, just let her know if you plan on being there. The other thing is, I think everybody got this from Maine School Management, came in mail. Sandy's going, I think some of us are going. It's not a bad idea to remember at the bottom, the RSVP is back to MSMA, not to,
Can you just say what it is, Marge?
oh, sorry, yes.
It's okay.
Oh, I know. Well,
It's okay.
it's for you guys. It's a candidate forum on the K through 12 education, and it's September 30th, and it's at Gorham Middle School, and what'll be happening is, it's from 6:30 to 7:30, and there are the candidates who are running for the Maine House and Senate for Cumberland County are supposed to be attending that, and they are giving an overview of some of the key issues facing public education, and then they will be asked to talk about their priorities and answer questions. So it's a good opportunity for any of the board members, first off, to show their support, and secondly, to get any questions answered that we normally we get trickled down. And from that, I go right to, I had received, well, Dave had, because he's the town council representative who goes to Augusta, and he had received this in the mail, and it's from the Maine Municipal Association, but Jim Jim Breyer has a nice piece in here, and it explains the 55%. I highlighted it. I was just going to do that piece of it and copy it, but when I went through the book, there's a lot of good information in here. So he called up there, and I should have got more books, but I got just enough so that everybody can have one and read it at your own convenience. You have yours.
I have one.
That one's yours. And this one's Dawn's.
Yeah.
Hang on to it.
Do you have one for Eric?
Eric, I left Eric's at central office already.
Okay.
I told him I'd leave it there. Okay, the other thing, and I was debating on whether to comment on it or not, but Jerry brought it up. As a board, it's kind of like a distant relatives, depending on how close you are. And we have a past member, Toby Pennells, that most of us know. This is very emotional. And was in a bad accident. And if everybody could kind of keep him in their thoughts and prayers, it would be great. He has done a lot for Wyndham when it was just Wyndham, and a lot from the district when we consolidated. And he's just a great guy, and it's a nice family. And if everybody could just keep him in their thoughts and prayers, it would be great. Okay. Saying that, okay, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor? We are adjourned.